role in the culture and the commerce of America. I'm going to talk specifically about something called the Times Square moment, but I want to set a little bit of context for where we are. I'm here partially as the president of the Times Square Alliance, which represents all the businesses in Times Square, but primarily as a board member of the Times Square Advertising Coalition, or TSAC. It's a group that came together a few years ago. From Clear Channel Spectacolor, Fred Rosenberg from Sherwood, which represents the signs on 1 and 2 Times Square, Gerald Griffin, who represents from ABC Sports and Entertainment Sales, who represents the ABC sign and a bunch of other signs, Don Blanton, who does much of the best commercial creative on the signs in Times Square from the Wow Factor, and Tommy Hennigan, who specializes in activating ground floor, the activation down on the ground that relates to the signs. So before talking about sort of the micro, just the bigger picture in terms of what we focused on at Times Square is, and it relates very much to the signs, is that the first 10 years we were about just trying to make Times Square clean, safe, and fun, as opposed to dirty, dangerous, and terrifying, which is what it was for many decades. By 2002, that basic work had been done, and then we turned to trying to emphasize what is it that's distinctive about this place. And at core, it has to do with several characteristics. We talk about creativity, energy, and edge. And there's creativity of a couple types that one sees immediately. There's a creativity that's within the boxes of the theaters. We are, after all, the theater district. But most strikingly is the creativity that is on display all the time on the giant signs in Times Square. It is there that you see instantly sort of the latest in whatever is going on sort of culturally or in terms of trends are reflected immediately in the advertisements that are up on the screen, and it's always been that way. There's the energy, literally the energy of just what's happening down on the street, but there's also literally the energy of the signs more and more now as there are more and more LEDs and electronic signs. And edge in the sense of always being on the cutting edge, but also sometimes being on the edge of what is proper or what is acceptable. And those are what we found, and I'll talk a little bit about how we got there. Those are what we found were the core characteristics. And signs have always been a part of that. Again, what's distinctive about Times Square? It's a theater district. You have the greatest concentration of theaters anywhere in the world. It's this physical space of this intersection, this huge, this kind of manic town square for New York City and for America. And then because of that physical space is why all the advertising developed, because it was this bowl that you could have all this advertising with. And that's made it an international icon, and that's part of the reason why people want to be there. Part of the reason we got there, and I want to talk about this because obviously anywhere you're advertising, you're thinking, what brand values are you associating yourself with? And one usually doesn't think of an advertising spot necessarily or a physical place as having a brand, but it really is true that Times Square has a brand, and so when you place an ad there, you're associating with that. So a few years back, we had Ogilvy and Mather, which was in our district, do an analysis and say, what is unique about this place? And it's about, it's synonymous with New York City, it's synonymous with the energy and the diversity and the edge of New York City, and it's about an experience. It's about the experience of being in this place, and that's why people come there and they take pictures, because they want to experience what it's like to be in this dense urban environment surrounded by all the energy of the signs. The other thing that one sees in the signs that is also characteristic of New York or Times Square is that it's always changing. There's always something unexpected, and that for better or for worse, New York is never the same from one minute to the next. And then the Times Square itself is a brand, and people have an emotional connection. It represents aspiration, opportunity, energy, and optimism. All these different things are things that Ogilvy and Mather said, these are the characteristics of the place that derive from its core characteristics: the theater, the creativity, the signs, the energy that's there. Once again, a slightly different way they slice it, that it's a brand that's enduring, it's iconic, it's extraordinary and unusual. It energizes you when you're there, and it's a connector with popular culture. Again, it's this mirror, it's this giant mood ring that reflects whatever is going on in our culture for one way or another. So because of all that that is why people are endlessly interested in being there in terms of having an advertising presence. 230 advertising signs, depending on where you define the boundaries of sort of the core of Times Square, hundreds of thousands of feet of advertising. And part of what's so interesting is how it keeps on growing. I'll talk about some of those larger trends. Part of what happens is that part of the reason people want to be there is because it really is the crossroads of the world. You have so many different things that are happening in terms of the people that are coming through Times Square. It's approximately 500,000 people a day that come through Times Square. Those numbers have been going up since the Broadway, the pedestrian plazas were formed. And obviously you've got tourists. What people don't always think about is that because of the neighborhood just to the west of Times Square and just the changing nature of Manhattan residential, there's more residents than ever. But especially the workers, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. There are an enormous number of people that work in these office towers, and even though there's tourists who may come just, a tourist from the Midwest who's just coming to check things out, there's an enormous number of business travelers. The Marriott Hotel, for instance, is the largest feeder hotel for all the people that go to the conventions at the Javits Center, and most of the rest of the hotels in Times Square do a very heavy business, have a very heavy proportion of business clients. And so that's another set of people that you're reaching, because sometimes people think it's only leisure travelers, but it's actually quite a few business travelers. All of this adds up to Times Square having an enormous economic impact, that 0.1% of New York City's land area produces 1 in every 10 jobs. That the economic output is as much as the downtown of Portland or Pittsburgh, $110 billion in economic activity. Part of that is because of tourism, because when you come and advertise in Times Square, you reach anybody who's interested in traveling. So every day I look out my windows and I see ads from India, from Turkey, from Mexico, folks that are trying to reach travelers that are walking through Times Square. So you've got a strong tourist presence. That's been growing. We have 21% of the hotel rooms, and again, a significant portion of that hotel room population is business travelers. It's the #1 tourist attraction in the US, according to Forbes. And part of what's interesting here is that, people go to the Empire State Building, they're taking pictures of everything around the Empire State Building. We are kind of like, we're sort of the man-made version of the Grand Canyon. People come there and what they do when they come here is they take the pictures of the signs. And that's part of what happens too, is that when you place an ad in Times Square, you're not just getting the people that are passing through. There is this enormous sort of secondary effect because so many people, literally everybody who comes there takes a picture with the signs in the background. They're not taking a picture of the ground. Another just core thing, again, entertainment. There's many people from the tri-state area, a lot of folks from who come to see the Broadway shows. The demographic of the folks that go to Broadway shows tends to be sort of an upper level demographic, and so that's another chunk of people. Every night, there's about 40,000 Broadway seats, so every night you've got 40,000 different people. One of the points that the theater folks make is that there's more people that go to Broadway shows in a year than go to all of the Mets and Yankees and sports games in the region combined, and it's a demographic that a lot more advertisers are interested in. The other thing is, again, people, because Times Square, because of the signs and because of the energy, people don't often realize the extent to which this is a huge office district. Again, 29 million square feet of office space. That's as much as the downtown districts of Philadelphia, Austin, or Portland, and several 100,000 people that are there every day, where you're getting the ability to sort of penetrate and reach them on a repeated basis. Lots of law firms, extraordinary mix of corporate entities that one doesn't think of when one thinks of Times Square, but it's media companies, it's law firms, it's banks. They are in Times Square, and those are the people you're reaching on a daily basis who are going through the neighborhood every single day. The result of all this is that the pedestrian activity in Times Square just keeps on growing. The numbers get, as Times Square becomes more popular, as there's more office workers, as there are more tourists, more and more people here. This is the subway ridership. We have more subway stations than anywhere else. And again, it's just about the enormity of the pedestrian traffic that's coming through Times Square. So we're going to run this. Why, again, do people come to see here? It's been the case throughout the century. So go ahead and run this. Throughout the century, people have come to see the most important brands in America on display in Times Square. This is courtesy of Clear Channel Spectacolor. And it's brands that people recognize. That was the Sony Jumbotron, which was really the first digital thing. And what you see again and again in the history of Times Square signage and advertising is that it is always a place. It's interesting to be here hearing the opening comments. It's always a place of where new technologies are introduced and new technologies are used to get people's attention. The reason Broadway is called the Great White Way is because of the white light that was created by all these incandescent bulbs from the advertisements along Broadway. So you see again and again and again that new technologies are here. You see in this case with Canon, where companies who want to make a statement that they are interested in the American market if they're from abroad come and make a statement. Looking back a little bit more, so it's a Great White Way. It's always been a place where technology was on display. Even the technology of smoke rings, you know, there's always the unexpected, and people come to Times Square expecting the unexpected, and that's part of the reason, for instance, we're doing this special Times Square moment. We're reminding people that people literally come to Times Square to see the show of what is going to happen with the signs in one way or another, and it's been that case for decades. All kinds of things get advertised. Some things come and some things go. This is two of the historic theaters on Times Square, best porn in town, and Jason is back. Now it's a theater for kids, amazing transformations. That doesn't mean that sex has left Times Square. It comes up in different forms and different shapes. And you know, that's part of what I talk about when it's Times Square is about edge, being a little bit on the edge of whatever is proper. This is completely tame these days, but when this happened, whenever it was a decade ago, you know, it was something was talked about quite a bit. One of the interesting parts of Times Square's story is that it almost wasn't so. There were plans to redevelop Times Square, and the solution was just wipe out everything. And so literally at one point in the 70s, the city said, we're going to build something, and this thing was going to be called Times Square Center, just like Rockefeller Center. And the whole idea was to make it serious and corporate. And what's the striking thing about these buildings? There's not a single sign on them. The signs were viewed as sort of the bad thing. Thank God, some groups like the Municipal Arts Society and other civic groups said, wait a minute, what is it special and distinctive about this place? And they said it's signs. And so most of you probably know that it's literally a legal requirement that if you have a building in Times Square, you must have a sign, and it must have a certain amount of animation, that, you know, blinking lights. It used to be just neon. Obviously the LED achieves that now, but very specific requirements. There's even this technical term called LUTs, which is Lights Unit Times Square, that they created as a way of measuring the light emanating from the signs. And that was about preserving this distinctive characteristic. Part of what's interesting is when the major corporate tenants began coming into Times Square, like Morgan Stanley and others, they were very resistant initially to the idea of having signs, because they said, you know, we're blue chip, we're serious, this is not really the spirit of our things. Part of what's so initially Morgan Stanley tried to get out of having any signage. They ended up with a kind of ticker tape, digital ticker tape. Then when they built what ended up being the Lehman Brothers headquarters, but it was initially for them, they had the most elaborate sign technology literally built into the face of the building. So part of what happens, and you saw this when Reuters came in, now Thomson Reuters, is that the signs themselves become a branding opportunity for the companies, and part of the newer trends is that it's also happening for retail. And then of course those signs are seen again in terms of the life beyond the people that walk through Times Square. It's the most photographed, most filmed place on the planet. It's most obvious when you think about New Year's Eve or you think about the Macy's Day Parade, but it's also just something that happens. And virtually any film you watch, if you're watching Smash last week, half of the thing is in Times Square. So all of the branding just gets this reach again and again and again. And it's because of this association with these core characteristics that it represents whatever's going on in New York City, whatever's going on in America, the creativity, the commerce, the energy, and the edge. In terms of some recent developments, the closing down of Broadway, the reconstruction of Duffy Square, which is right here where you have the red steps, has turned Times Square from a place that you sort of suffer and pass through into a place where people are lingering and sitting and watching. So what we've heard repeatedly from the folks in the advertising business is that this has been very good because, in the sign business, because the dwell time is much greater. I mean, it literally used to be, it was literally difficult to walk a few blocks because it was so crowded. We were a victim of our own success. By having this enormous increase in space, by having places where people sit, we finally have recognized and acknowledged that there are people that come to see the show. They come to see the show of Times Square in terms of who's down on the street, but also the show of what's on the signs. And so again, unlike so many other out-of-home opportunities where people are passing by, this is a place, A, where people sort of slow down and stop and look. They look because they want to see, because they're expecting something different to happen. They're taking a picture of it and then going from there. So a lot more people down there. That's increased also our capacity, so the pedestrian numbers have been going up about 10 or 15% last year. And again, they're spending more time there out on the plazas. Some of the other ways in which I've seen sort of the sign world evolving in Times Square. There's always been an international presence, but it seems more and more. I talked about all the foreign entities that are always advertising to reach tourists. But it also, as it was with, say, sort of Canon or Panasonic or TDK in the past, it's also a place where, again, a company that says it's coming to New York makes a statement, or coming to America. So not only do you have Hyundai, who bought a major thing on 2 Times Square, but you have Xinhua, the Chinese news agency that used to be in Astoria, Queens, and said, we're going to come and we're going to make a statement about our presence in America. That was followed shortly after by another sign that features mostly Chinese advertising on 1 Times Square. So that's one trend. The other thing is that we've always had flagship retail, significant retail in Times Square, but the retailers have realized that the signs are part of their key asset. And sometimes they sell them to third party, and sometimes they just use them to enhance their brand and to engage people more. Obviously, a huge trend towards LEDs. You see that everywhere, but particularly in Times Square. And enormous interactivity, and not only interactivity that happens, but interactivity that gets covered, and then because it gets covered in the press and people know about it, it sort of travels throughout all the digital media in every way. So it seems like every week, every month, there's some new way in which people are engaging people down on the ground to interact with the signs, whether it's through event activation because we have more space down there, or in other ways. And there was a recent article in Bloomberg that just talked about this, that the dwell time is increased, that there's these dial-in activities, all these different interactive signs that are happening in Times Square, Facebook, YouTube, and the interactivity that you're going to be talking about today is always on display in Times Square. And then again, once it happens, this, it gets into the major media outlets as a place where people talk about some new technique is being used. So if you've got some new idea you want to premiere and you want people to know about it, if you do it in Times Square, it's multiplied many, many times. Gets out into, again, all of these publications. And again, sometimes just the non-advertising, but the sort of the symbolic or political implications of a sign. Who can forget the debt clock that went up, or the clock? There was another thing that showed the number of guns that were unregistered, handguns that were unregistered. So there's always an opportunity as well for political messaging in Times Square, paid political messaging. This is another example of that interactive screen interactive activity on the Hyundai screen, again being covered by the news, Times, everybody. This is the Clear Channel screen on the right, where there's, again, new forms of interactivity with a sign with different kinds of brands. So now to talk about the Times Square moment. The Times Square moment is something that the Advertising Coalition came up with a few years ago as a way of doing something a little bit different, but that is consistent with the essence of Times Square, which is to do something that is a little bit unexpected. So you'll see in the video that I'm going to show, and you're going to see it in a video what the program is going to be in May, that it's in a place where everything's completely dynamic and fast, it sort of slows it down a little bit. and it takes over, you know, for right now we've got about 10 or 15 screens. We hope, you know, a year from now that we have 40 or 50 screens, and that every single screen in Times Square is participating in this. So the basic idea is to have creative, non-commercial content just for a few minutes, and sometimes it may be art, sometimes it may be great graphics. We hope in the next year to team up with some student groups and do some things where we're curating some things from students, but distinctive creative content that is the unexpected there, that makes people look so that on either side of when they're looking at this creative content, maybe there's more opportunities for some ads there. But also, it's a chance to sort of stop and look. And the key characteristic is that it is all the signs sort of happening at once, in sync in some way. And again, we started with a critical mass of 10 or 15. We hope to get, you know, all of them. So this becomes, it's a reminder of what people already do, which is that they come to Times Square to see the signs and to take the pictures. So this is on the Thomson Reuters and the NASDAQ screens, highlighted a little bit different. This is the beginning of it. We just premiered it this spring. We chose something that was flowers, and you'll see it's sort of a little bit of an ironic twist on flowers, and maybe how some of you feel during allergy season. We thought that, you know, since we were launching right around the beginning of spring, we wanted to do something that referenced that, but also made use of the amazing graphics capacity. This is something, a work of art that had been created for another purpose, but we approached the person. This is the folks from that I had mentioned from Times Square Advertising Coalition, the key board members who made this happen. So I think we can run the video here. This is on the American Eagle screen. Enormous technical challenges in reformatting anything for all of these different screens. But what you see is that it ends up being worth it. Enormous technical challenges for a rube like me. You guys may be able to do it easily. But when we, the advantage of this, and this is a still slow motion thing, it goes from 11:57 to midnight p.m. Every night, and part of the idea is to have it a regularly scheduled thing that happens every night for the year, so that people come to expect it. And initially, we're going to change it out once every month. It may be, if we get content and we get the technical processes down, it may get changed out more often. So here in slow motion are some of the flowers being transformed into something else besides flowers. And this is just one angle when you're looking at it from the American Eagle screen. When you're standing there in the middle of Times Square, you see this on many other screens all around you. And again, if you can imagine this happening on 40 or 50 screens maybe a year from now, then the impact is enormous. Even with 10 or 15, it sort of stops and gets your attention. And again, it's about reminding people of these core characteristics, that the creative happens, the unexpected happens, things that you might not imagine otherwise. And even this, just that, to have something that starts off as pretty, it changes into something else, and then this slow motion effect in a place that is always so dynamic, even at midnight, sort of slows you down. We started with midnight partially because of the association with New Year's Eve. We think that there may be, as we go through the year, there may be other times that we establish as set times when people can come there and learn to look at this. This has got an enormous amount of coverage in both sort of the media and the arts press. We think that it's going to keep growing as a phenomenon. I'm going to just go forward. The next installation on May 1st is another variation of what you can do with many, many different screens, which is Robert Wilson, who's a world-famous artist and theater producer and director, has these video portraits where it's very, very still images. They're videos, but they're very still images of a whole bunch of people. These are going to be, it's going to be a video portrait gallery that sort of takes over so that you can have in a coordinated way, again, blanket the area, slightly different images on each of the screens, and experience that. Obviously, this is something that can be done for commercial purposes too. There's a mechanism that you can sort of plug into if you're interested in taking over a whole bunch of the screens for commercial purposes. So it's another way of highlighting that as well. So that's the snapshot of what's going on in terms of the Times Square moment and just the larger context of Times Square and signs in New York City and in America. Okay.
So, just two quick questions for me, and if anybody in the audience has any. One is that flower campaign is awesome. You know, it's content. I love the idea that you're creating contextual content, but it begs the question about advertising adjacencies. I can think of a lot of allergy remedies that would have loved to be adjacent to that. Is that something you've thought about at all?
I mean, you know, we realized, I mean, the core idea was we wanted to do something distinctive that brought attention to the Times Square Advertising Coalition, reminded people of this incredibly unique set of assets that people go and see where creative things are always happening. And then, I mean, it may be that some of the guys who are more involved in the business thought immediately that there were some commercial possibilities from it, but it started off as really sort of a civic thing, a gift to the city. But I think that I do think that there's enormous possibilities. Either, you know, right before and after the showing, especially if people come to expect it, because they'll be there armed with their cameras, or in adjacent signs to do something.
Yeah, it would be a great ad network. And then also that concept of 11:57 to midnight, you're actually like starting a day part Times Square, if you think about it, in the sense of creating time for people to expect content. Will that actually run on midnight?
Well, it all depends. You know, a lot of times.
I'm sorry, on New Year's Eve, midnight.
On New Year's Eve. We haven't crossed that bridge yet. We're co-producers of New Year's Eve, and there's, I mean, usually at that time, actually, there's so much going on in the square with the performances that might be complicated. But you know, we hadn't even gotten to that. We've been so focused on the immediate thing.
Any questions for Tim? Okay, well, I want to thank you. We have a tight schedule here, so thank you for compressing